The Jeffersons were enjoying a lazy Sunday morning in their cozy home, the sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. John was sipping his coffee, reading the newspaper, while Linda hummed softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. Emily, their daughter, was upstairs, supposedly studying for her college finals. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, the kind that made Whispering Pines such an idyllic place to live. Then came the knock at the door. It was a hesitant, almost apologetic sound, the kind of knock that sends a shiver down your spine for no discernible reason. John glanced at Linda, raising an eyebrow, and she shrugged, wiping her hands on a towel. "I'll get it," she said, heading towards the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Sheriff Daniels standing on the porch, his hat clutched in his hands, a troubled look etched across his weathered face. "Morning, Sheriff," she greeted him, a faint unease creeping into her voice. "What brings you here so early?" The sheriff cleared his throat, his eyes darting around nervously before settling on her face. "Morning, Linda. Is John home? I need to speak with both of you." Her heart skipped a beat. "Of course, come in." She called for John, who joined them in the living room, a look of confusion on his face. "What's this about, Sheriff?" John asked, his voice steady, but Linda could see the tension in the way he held his coffee cup. Sheriff Daniels hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his hands trembling slightly, and handed it to John. "I found this in my mailbox this morning." John took the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the handwritten words scrawled across it. Linda peered over his shoulder, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the contents of the note. "To the incompetent sheriff of Whispering Pines. Here's a freebie. Try looking in the Jeffersons' backyard. You might find something interesting. Signed, The Quiet Town Killer." Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What is this? Some kind of sick joke?" Sheriff Daniels shook his head slowly. "I don't think so, Linda. We've been receiving these notes for a while now, but this is the first time they've mentioned a specific location. I had to come check." John's face turned pale, and he looked at the sheriff in disbelief. You think we're involved in this? That we have something to do with those murders?" The sheriff raised a placating hand. "I'm not saying that, but I need to follow every lead, no matter how absurd it might seem. I'd like your permission to search the backyard." For a moment, no one spoke. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in. Linda could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel, each second stretching into an eternity. She glanced at John, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course," John said finally, his voice strained. "You can search wherever you need to, Sheriff. We've got nothing to hide." Sheriff Daniels nodded, relief washing over his features. "Thank you. This is just a formality, I'm sure." But as he stepped outside, followed closely by the Jeffersons, a sense of dread settled over Linda like a dark cloud. She glanced up at Emily's bedroom window, half expecting to see her daughter's face peering down at them. But the window was empty, the curtains drawn shut. Linda shook her head, forcing herself to focus. This was ridiculous. There was no way their sweet Emily could have anything to do with this. She was a good girl, a smart girl, not some deranged killer. The sheriff would search the yard, find nothing, and this nightmare would be over. Or so she thought. Because as the sheriff's deputies began digging near the edge of the yard, their shovels hit something solid, something that wasn't just soil or rock. Linda's heart pounded in her chest as she watched them uncover a small, weathered box buried deep beneath the surface. Sheriff Daniels carefully opened it, his face paling as he pulled out the contents. A collection of items that made Linda's blood run cold. A locket, a blood-stained scarf, a broken watch. All things that had been reported missing from the victims of the Quiet Town Killer. She staggered back, her mind reeling, unable to process what she was seeing. John caught her as she swayed, his own face a mask of shock and disbelief. But how?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "How did these things get here?" The sheriff looked at them, his eyes filled with a mix of pity and determination. "I don't know, Linda, but I need to ask. Is Emily home?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Linda felt like she was drowning, her lungs burning as the realization slowly dawned on her. She turned her gaze back to the house, to the closed door that led to the basement, to the place where Emily had spent so much time alone. And in that moment, she knew. She didn't want to believe it, couldn't believe it, but deep down, she knew the truth. Their daughter, their sweet, innocent Emily, was the quiet town killer. Linda's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled back, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality that was unfolding around her. John's grip tightened around her arm, his eyes wide with disbelief. The sheriff's question echoed in her head, reverberating through her thoughts like a broken record. Is Emily home? Yes, she's upstairs, John stammered, his voice cracking under the strain. She's been in her room all morning. Sheriff Daniels exchanged a grim look with his deputies. I need to speak with her, John. This is serious. Linda wanted to scream, to tell the sheriff he was wrong, that this was all a terrible mistake. But the words caught in her throat as she looked at the box again, at the gruesome trophies of murder and mayhem. She couldn't deny what was right in front of her. I'll go get her, she whispered, her feet moving of their own accord as she turned toward the house. John followed her, his face pale, his hands still gripping hers as if he was afraid she might slip away. They climbed the stairs in silence, each step a small eternity. Linda's heart pounded in her chest, her pulse roaring in her ears as they reached the landing. She paused outside Emily's door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She could hear the faint sound of music playing inside, a cheerful tune that seemed grotesquely out of place in this moment of horror. Emily, she called softly, her voice trembling. The music stopped abruptly, and there was a moment of silence before Emily's voice floated through the door. Yeah, Mom? Linda swallowed hard, trying to force the panic down. Can you come out here for a minute, sweetie? Sheriff Daniels needs to talk to you. There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Emily appeared in the doorway, her face a picture of innocence. She looked at them with wide, curious eyes, a smile playing on her lips. What's going on? She asked, glancing between her parents and the sheriff, who stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching intently. Linda's heart ached at the sight of her daughter, at the normalcy of her expression. This couldn't be real. There was no way that the girl standing in front of her could be the same person who had committed such monstrous acts. Emily, John began, his voice shaky. The sheriff found some things in the backyard, things that belonged to the people who were killed. Emily's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. What do you mean? What kind of things? Linda felt like she was going to be sick. A scarf, a locket, things like that. Do you know anything about them, Emily? Have you seen them before? There was a flicker of something in Emily's eyes, something dark and fleeting, but it was gone before Linda could grasp it. She shook her head slowly, her brow furrowed in confusion. No, of course not. Why would I know anything about that? Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, his face a mask of calm authority. Emily, we need to ask you a few questions. It's just a formality, but we need to make sure we cover all our bases. Would you be willing to come down to the station with us? Emily's gaze shifted to the sheriff, and for a split second, Linda saw something chilling in her daughter's eyes. A cold, calculating look that made her blood run cold. But then Emily smiled, a soft, reassuring smile, and the moment passed. Sure, Sheriff, she said sweetly. I'll help however I can. I didn't do anything wrong. Linda's knees buckled as the words washed over her, the denial and confusion swirling in her mind. She watched helplessly as Emily descended the stairs, the sheriff's hand resting gently on her shoulder. John turned to Linda, his eyes filled with desperation. She didn't do this, Linda. She couldn't have. This is a mistake. But Linda couldn't speak. Her voice was trapped in her throat, suffocated by the crushing weight of her doubts. She followed them down the stairs in a daze, her mind reeling, grasping at straws, trying to find an explanation that made sense. As they stepped outside, the cool air hit her like a slap to the face, jolting her back to reality. The deputies were gathered around the open box, their faces grim. Emily stood beside the sheriff, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her expression calm and collected. "Let's get this over with, okay?" she said, glancing at the sheriff with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Sheriff Daniels nodded, his jaw tight. "We'll do this by the book, Emily. You have my word." He led her to the patrol car, and she slid into the back seat without protest. Linda watched, her heart breaking, as the door closed with a finality that felt like the slamming of a coffin lid. She reached for John's hand, clutching it desperately as the car pulled away, taking their daughter with it. For a long moment, they stood there in silence, the world around them spinning out of control. Linda could hear the murmur of the deputies, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it all seemed far away, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. "What do we do now?" John asked hoarsely, his voice breaking. Linda turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know." They stood there, holding each other, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the lawn. The perfect morning was shattered, the peace of whispering pines forever broken. And deep down, in the darkest corner of her heart, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the worst was yet to come. The drive to the police station was excruciatingly silent. Emily sat in the back seat, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her eyes staring out the window as if she were on a casual trip through town. Sheriff Daniels kept glancing at her in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. He'd known the Jeffersons for years, had watched Emily grow up. She'd always been such a sweet, polite girl. The idea that she could be the quiet town killer seemed absurd. And yet, the evidence was right there, staring him in the face. As they pulled up to the station, Emily turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. She gave him a small smile, almost as if she knew what he was thinking. "Are we almost there, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice light, almost teasing. Sheriff Daniels nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah, we're here." Inside the station, they led Emily to an interrogation room, its walls bare and uninviting, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. She sat down at the small metal table, folding her hands neatly in front of her, her expression serene. Sheriff Daniels exchanged a glance with Detective Roberts, who had joined them in the room. The detective had been working the quiet town killer case from the beginning, and his usually stoic face was now etched with skepticism and curiosity. "Emily," Sheriff Daniels began carefully, taking a seat across from her, "we just want to ask you a few questions, okay? You don't have to say anything without a lawyer present, but the sooner we clear this up, the better." Emily nodded, her eyes wide and innocent. "I understand, Sheriff. I just want to help." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Can you tell us where you were last Friday night? Between the hours of 10 p.m. and 2 a.m.? Emily frowned, tilting her head slightly as she thought. "I was at home, I think, studying for my psychology exam. I didn't go out." Sheriff Daniels leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure about that? Can anyone confirm it?" She smiled, a small, almost pitying smile. "Well, my parents were asleep, but you can check with my professor. I turned in my paper first thing in the morning." Detective Roberts cleared his throat, pulling out a file. "We have reason to believe that the quiet town killer was active during those hours. A man was found dead near the old sawmill. He'd been killed in the same way as the others." He placed a photo on the table, a picture of the victim, his face frozen in terror. "Does this man look familiar to you?" Emily's eyes flicked to the photo, then back to the detective's face. She shook her head slowly. "No, I've never seen him before. It's awful what happened to him, though." There was no tremor in her voice, no hesitation, no sign of guilt. Sheriff Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. If she was lying, she was doing an incredibly good job of it. "We found a note in your handwriting," he continued, his voice firmer now. "A note describing these murders in detail. Can you explain that?" Emily's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, a flicker of something dark crossed her face. "A note in my handwriting? That's crazy. Someone must be trying to frame me." Detective Roberts leaned in, his eyes locked on hers. "Emily, we found items linked to the victims in your backyard. Trophies. How do you explain that? She blinked, her expression one of genuine confusion. What? No, that's not possible. I've never seen those things before. You must be mistaken. The room seemed to close in on Sheriff Daniels as he watched her. There was no fear in her eyes, no sign of panic. She was calm, collected, almost too calm. He felt a gnawing sense of dread creeping up his spine. "You're not making this easy, Emily," he said softly. "If you know anything, now is the time to tell us." For a moment, there was silence. Emily looked down at her hands, as if considering something, then back up at the sheriff. Her eyes were different now, darker, colder. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was almost amused. "I told you, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft and sweet, like she was talking to a child. "I don't know anything about those murders. I'm just a girl from Whispering Pines. But whoever this killer is, they seem very clever, don't you think?" Sheriff Daniels' blood ran cold. There was something in her tone, something that made his heart pound painfully in his chest. She was playing with him, he realized with a sickening lurch. This wasn't the scared girl they'd expected to find. This was someone entirely different. Detective Roberts slammed his hand down on the table, his frustration boiling over. "You think this is a game, Emily? People are dead. We're talking about murder." Emily flinched, but it wasn't fear that flashed across her face. It was annoyance. "I'm not playing any games, Detective. I'm just trying to help. But if you're going to keep accusing me of things I didn't do, then maybe I should get a lawyer after all." Sheriff Daniels put a hand on Robert's arm, signaling him to calm down. They weren't going to get anywhere like this. He stood up, his mind racing. "Okay, Emily, we'll stop here for now. But we're not done, you understand?" She nodded, her smile returning, but it was a hollow, chilling thing. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm not going anywhere." As they left the room, Sheriff Daniels felt the weight of what they were dealing with settle over him like a heavy shroud. This girl, this young woman, was nothing like they had thought. She was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. "We need to find out everything we can about her," he muttered to Roberts as they stepped into the hallway. "Her past, her friends, everything." Roberts nodded, his face grim. "What are you thinking?" Sheriff Daniels glanced back at the closed door of the interrogation room, his jaw set. "I think we're looking at the quiet town killer, Roberts, and she's playing a game we're not ready for." As they walked away, Emily sat alone in the sterile room, her eyes gleaming with a cold, quiet amusement. She leaned back in her chair, a small, satisfied smile spreading across her lips. The game had only just begun. Linda and John sat in their living room, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. It had been hours since Sheriff Daniels had taken Emily to the station, and each passing minute only deepened the chasm of dread that had opened up in their hearts. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, but neither of them seemed to notice. Linda's mind was racing, a chaotic whirlwind of memories and questions. How had they missed it? How could they not have known? She glanced at John, who was staring blankly at the floor, his face ashen. "What do we do now, John?" she whispered, her voice trembling. John shook his head, his shoulders slumped. "I don't know, Linda. I don't know." Before she could respond, there was a sharp knock on the door. They both jumped, their nerves frayed, and exchanged a quick, anxious glance. Linda rose shakily to her feet and opened the door to find Detective Roberts standing there, a grim look on his face. "Mrs. Jefferson, we need to conduct a more thorough search of your home," he said, his voice professional but edged with something darker. "We have a warrant." Linda felt a surge of panic. "A search? But you've already searched the backyard. What more could you possibly need?" Robert's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained hard. "We need to be thorough, ma'am. It's important." John joined them at the door, his face pale. "We'll cooperate, Detective. Just be careful, okay? This is our home." Roberts nodded, signaling to the officers behind him. They filed into the house, spreading out with a methodical efficiency that made Linda's stomach twist. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, watching as strangers tore apart her home, her life, looking for evidence that could destroy everything she thought she knew. She followed them upstairs, her heart pounding in her chest as they approached Emily's room. They had already searched it earlier, finding nothing of immediate significance. But now they were being more meticulous, pulling out drawers, emptying shelves, looking for anything that might have been hidden. Linda stood in the doorway, wringing her hands as she watched. This was her daughter's room, filled with the familiar clutter of a teenager's life. Textbooks, notebooks, posters on the walls, a collection of trinkets and photos. It all seemed so normal, so painfully normal. One of the officers, a young woman with sharp eyes, pulled out Emily's desk chair and began inspecting the underside of the desk. She ran her fingers along the wooden surface, then paused, her expression changing. "Detective, I think I found something." Linda's heart lurched as the officer produced a small key from the underside of the desk, taped there in a way that would have been invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. She handed it to Detective Roberts, who examined it closely, then glanced at Linda. "Do you know what this opens, Mrs. Jefferson?" Linda shook her head, her throat dry. "No, I've never seen it before." Roberts nodded, turning his attention back to the room. His gaze swept over the space, then landed on the closet. He walked over, pulling the door open and kneeling down. His hands moved over the floorboards, pressing and probing until he found what he was looking for. A small, almost invisible lock embedded in the wood. He inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a quiet, ominous sound, and he lifted a section of the floorboards away, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as Roberts reached in and pulled out a small metal box, dusty and old. He set it on the floor and opened it carefully. Inside, there was a collection of items that made Linda's blood run cold. A bundle of letters, carefully folded and tied with a ribbon. Photographs, some of people she recognized, others of strangers, all of them marked with dates and locations in Emily's handwriting. And then there were the trophies, small, personal items that must have belonged to the victims. A ring, a bracelet, a keychain. Things that could only have been taken from them during or after their deaths. Linda felt the room spinning around her as the reality of what she was seeing crashed down on her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't a mistake. This was a collection, a record of her daughter's twisted deeds. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, this can't be real. This can't be happening." John, who had been standing silently behind her, let out a strangled cry. "Oh God, Emily, what have you done?" Roberts looked at them, his face etched with a mixture of pity and determination. "I'm sorry, but we need to take this in as evidence." Linda felt like her legs were going to give out. She stumbled back, clutching the doorframe for support, her mind a whirl of disbelief and horror. How could this be possible? How could they have raised a monster without even realizing it? As the officers cataloged the contents of the box, Linda's eyes fell on the letters. They were addressed to her and John, each one marked with a different date. Her hands trembling, she reached for the top one and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakably Emily's, neat and precise. "Dear Mom and Dad, by the time you read this, I'll probably be gone. I know you're probably confused, scared, angry. You must be wondering how this happened, how I could do something like this. The truth is, I've been like this for a long time, longer than you know. I've just gotten better at hiding it. You always told me to follow my passions, to do what makes me happy. Well, this is what makes me happy. The thrill, the control, the feeling of being alive. I know you'll never understand, and I don't expect you to, but I want you to know this isn't your fault. This is who I am. I'm sorry, in my own way, but I don't regret anything. I had to do this. I needed to, and you needed to know. I love you, in the only way I can. I hope you can forgive me someday. Emily." Linda's hands shook so violently that the letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. She collapsed onto her knees, sobs racking her body as the weight of her daughter's words crushed her soul. John knelt beside her, his own face a mask of agony. "Why, Emily? Why?" But there was no answer, only the echo of their grief filling the empty room. a family shattered by the darkness that had been hiding right under their noses. And in the quiet, Linda could almost hear Emily's voice, soft and mocking, whispering in the back of her mind. "You should have seen this coming, Mom. You should have known." But they hadn't, and now it was too late. Emily sat alone in the cold, sterile cell at the Whispering Pines police station, her hands cuffed to the metal table. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face. She looked calm, almost bored, as if this were just another ordinary day. Outside the small window, the sky was darkening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the town. Sheriff Daniels stood outside the interrogation room, watching her through the one-way glass. He rubbed his temples, exhaustion and disbelief etched into his features. Beside him, Detective Roberts was reviewing the evidence they had collected from the Jeffersons' house, his expression one of grim determination. "We have enough to charge her, Sheriff," Roberts said quietly. "The trophies, the letters, it's more than enough to put her away for life." Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Emily. "I know, but something doesn't add up. Why would she keep those letters? Why would she hide the trophies where they could be found? It's almost like she wanted us to find them." Roberts frowned, glancing at Emily's profile through the glass. "Maybe she did. Maybe this is all part of some sick game to her." The sheriff shook his head, his gut telling him there was more to this than they were seeing. "I'm going to talk to her one more time." Roberts nodded reluctantly. "Be careful, Sheriff. She's not what she seems." Sheriff Daniels entered the room, his face a mask of calm resolve. Emily looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with something that might have been amusement. "Sheriff Daniels," she greeted him, her voice soft and melodic. "Back for another chat?" He took a seat across from her, his gaze steady. "Emily, we've found more evidence. We've read your letters. We know everything." Emily tilted her head slightly, a small smile playing on her lips. "Do you? Because I don't think you do." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "You're going to prison for a very long time, Emily. There's no way out of this." She sighed dramatically, leaning back in her chair. "Oh, Sheriff, you really don't get it, do you? I'm not worried about prison. I'm not worried about any of this." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then what are you worried about?" Her smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous, almost predatory light. "I'm worried that you're focusing on the wrong things, that you're looking at the wrong person." The sheriff's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I mean, you really think I did all of this alone? Come on, Sheriff. You're smarter than that." His mind reeled, his thoughts racing. "Are you saying there's someone else involved? An accomplice?" Emily shrugged, her smile never faltering. "Maybe, maybe not. But you should be asking yourself, why now? Why did I suddenly get so careless? Why did I let you find everything so easily?" Sheriff Daniels felt a chill run down his spine. "Because you wanted to be caught." Emily chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe I wanted someone else to be caught. Someone who's been very, very naughty." The sheriff's pulse quickened. "Who, Emily? Who are you talking about?" She leaned back, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "You'll see. But you better hurry, Sheriff. The clock is ticking." Daniel stood up abruptly, his mind racing. He needed to call his team, needed to warn them. If Emily wasn't the only one involved, if there was someone else out there, they could still be in danger. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "One more thing, Sheriff," she called, her tone sing-song. "Check the basement. You might find something interesting." He froze, turning back to face her. "The basement?" She winked, her smile widening into a grin that sent a shiver of fear down his spine. "Happy hunting." He didn't wait to hear more. He bolted out of the room, grabbing his radio. "I need units to the Jefferson house now. Search the basement. Repeat, search the basement." The next few minutes were a blur of chaos and activity. Deputies raced to the Jeffersons' home, Linda and John watching in stunned silence as they swarmed the property. The basement door, which had been previously overlooked in the initial search, was forced open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. Sheriff Daniels arrived just as they were descending the steps, his heart in his throat. He followed them down, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was damp and musty, and the narrow staircase creaked under their weight. As they reached the bottom, his flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing a horrifying sight. The basement was like a macabre shrine, the walls covered with photographs and newspaper clippings, all relating to the murders. But it wasn't the trophies that made his blood run cold. It was the bed in the corner, the chains attached to it, and the figure lying there, barely moving. It was a man, his face bruised and bloodied, his wrists and ankles bound. He looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes, and Sheriff Daniels felt his stomach drop as he recognized him. It was Detective Roberts. "Help me," Roberts croaked, his voice hoarse and weak. Daniels rushed to his side, his mind spinning. "Roberts, what the hell happened?" But before he could get an answer, his radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, we've got a problem. The patrol car. Emily's gone." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned back to Roberts, his heart pounding in his chest. "Roberts, what happened? Who did this to you?" Roberts struggled to speak, his voice barely a whisper. It was her. It was." But before he could finish, a deafening explosion rocked the house above them, the force of it sending debris raining down from the ceiling. Daniels threw himself over Roberts, shielding him as the basement shook. When the dust settled, he looked up, his ears ringing. The house was on fire, the flames spreading rapidly. He grabbed Roberts, hauling him to his feet, and shouted to the deputies, "Get out! Get out now!" They stumbled up the stairs, the heat from the flames searing their skin as they burst through the basement door and into the yard. The house was fully engulfed now, the fire roaring like a living beast, consuming everything in its path. Linda and John were screaming, being held back by officers as they watched their home burn. Daniels collapsed on the grass, coughing, his eyes stinging from the smoke. "Emily," he gasped, his mind racing. "Where's Emily?" One of the deputies shook his head, his face pale. "We don't know, Sheriff. She's gone. She escaped." Daniel's heart sank as he looked at the burning house, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. Emily had played them all. This was never about getting caught. It was about sending a message, about letting them know that she was in control. And now she was gone, vanished into the night, leaving them with nothing but ashes and horror. As the flames roared and the sirens wailed, Sheriff Daniels knew one thing for certain: the game was far from over. The days after the fire were a blur for Whispering Pines. The charred remains of the Jeffersons' home stood as a grim reminder of the horror that had lurked beneath the surface. Linda and John, released from questioning, remained under a cloud of suspicion. Reporters and onlookers whispered, "How did they not know? Were they involved? Where's Emily now?" Linda clutched John's arm, her voice barely audible. "What are we going to do, John? We've lost everything." "I don't know, Linda. I just don't know," John whispered, his hands trembling. Sheriff Daniels approached, his face etched with exhaustion. "Mr. and Mrs. Jefferson, I'm so sorry. I can't imagine how hard this is." "Where is she, Sheriff? Where's our daughter?" Linda asked, tears brimming in her eyes. "We've issued a nationwide alert. Every agency is looking for her, but she's smart. She could be anywhere," Daniels replied heavily. Linda's legs wobbled as John wrapped his arm around her, both lost in their grief. "She was our little girl," John choked out. "How could this happen?" "We'll bring her in, I promise," Daniels assured them. The next few weeks were filled with FBI and state police scouring Whispering Pines, trying to piece together how Emily had hidden her deadly secret for so long. But she had vanished without a trace, leaving only devastation behind. Then, one cold morning, everything changed. Sheriff Daniels received a call from Agent Morrison with the FBI. "We've found her. Seattle. She was spotted by a traffic camera using a stolen car. We're moving in." Daniel's heart raced. "Be careful, Agent. She's dangerous." Hours later, they got the news. Emily had been found alone in an abandoned warehouse, waiting for them with a smile on her face. There was no struggle, no resistance. As they loaded her into the police van, She turned to one of the agents and said softly, "You know, this is only the beginning." Back in Whispering Pines, the news spread quickly. Emily Jefferson, the quiet town killer, was in custody. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief, though it was fragile. The scars she had left would not heal easily. Linda and John were called to the station to meet with the FBI. They were told of Emily's capture, but it all felt surreal, as if they were hearing about someone else's child. When they were finally allowed to see her, they hesitated, then stepped inside the visiting room, their hearts pounding. "Mom, Dad," Emily greeted them with a small smile. "I'm glad you came." Linda's legs buckled as she sank into the chair. "Why, Emily?" she sobbed. "Why did you do this?" "I did what I had to do, what I wanted to do. It's just who I am," Emily replied calmly. "But we love you. We raised you. How could you be this person?" John whispered, his voice breaking. Emily's smile faded. "I love you too in my own way, but that doesn't change anything. I am who I am." Linda broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "You're our daughter," John said, tears streaming down his face. "We'll always love you, but we can't understand." Emily watched them, her expression inscrutable. "I know, and that's okay." In the weeks that followed, Whispering Pines began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The Jeffersons' home was demolished, but the memory lingered. Linda and John moved to a small town upstate, trying to piece together their shattered lives. One day, months after they had settled in, a package arrived. Linda opened it with trembling hands. Inside was Emily's journal, filled with meticulous accounts of every murder, every plan. At the end, a letter addressed to them. "Dear Mom and Dad, I know you're trying to forget, but you'll always be wondering, what did you miss? What could you have done differently? And the answer is, nothing. I am who I am, and there was nothing you could have done. You think you're safe now, far away in your new home, but you're not. I'm still here, in your minds, in your hearts. You'll never be rid of me. I love you, Emily." Linda dropped the journal, her hands shaking violently. John picked it up, his face pale. They sat there, the horror crashing down on them again, fresh and raw. In their new home, they could almost hear her laughter, echoing through the empty rooms, haunting them. And in a prison cell hundreds of miles away, Emily Jefferson leaned back against the cold concrete wall, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. The game wasn't over. It would never be over. Several months had passed since Emily's capture, but for Linda and John, time stood still. They barely spoke, their days filled with silence and nights haunted by nightmares of their daughter. One cold evening, Linda sat alone, staring blankly at the television, when the doorbell rang. Her heart leapt into her throat. They had taken great pains to remain anonymous, to leave their past behind. She got up slowly and peered through the peephole. A man in his late 30s stood on the porch, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. She opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Jefferson, I presume?" Linda's blood ran cold. "I'm sorry, you must be mistaken." The man's smile widened. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm looking for." Panic surged through Linda as he forced his way inside. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Eric," he said, his tone almost friendly. "I'm here because of Emily." Linda's knees went weak. "What do you know about her?" Eric's smile faded. "More than you can imagine. I've been corresponding with her." Linda's heart pounded. "That's impossible. She's in prison." Eric shook his head. "Emily is special. She's found ways to get messages out." Before Linda could react, John appeared in the doorway. "Who the hell are you? Get out." Eric pulled out a small, black notebook. "Emily asked me to deliver this to you." John took the notebook, his hands shaking as he read it. "What is this?" Eric leaned in, his eyes gleaming. "It's a list of everyone she planned to kill. There's one name left, you." Linda felt the room spinning. Why would she do this? Eric shrugged. She said the person who gave her life should be the one to take it away. But since she can't be here, John stepped back, his hands shaking. "You're insane." Eric's smile vanished. "This isn't about you anymore. This is about finishing what she started." "Please," Linda begged. her voice breaking. "We're her parents. We didn't know." Eric's gaze softened slightly. "Emily said you needed to suffer to understand. She said you needed to pay." Before John could react, Eric pulled a knife from his coat. Linda screamed as he lunged forward. John intercepted him, and the knife plunged into his side. "No!" Linda screamed, rushing to John's side as he collapsed, clutching his wound. "Stay with me, John, please." Eric watched them with a detached curiosity. "I'm sorry, but Emily was very clear." "Get out!" Linda shouted, her eyes blazing with fury and hatred. "Get out of our house." Eric nodded. "Okay, but remember, this is only the beginning. There are more of us than you think." He walked out, leaving the door open behind him. Linda barely registered his departure, her hands still pressed against John's wound, her mind screaming in denial. "John, please, hold on," she whispered, her tears falling onto his shirt. But John's eyes were glazing over. "No, no, no," she cried. "Please, John, don't leave me. I can't do this alone." But he was gone, his body still and lifeless. Linda collapsed onto his chest, her sobs racking her body. And in her prison cell, far away, Emily sat on her bed, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. Now they know. Now they all know. The game was over. But the nightmare had just begun.